Okay, now you've seen this before, but I want to walk through it again because it's important, and it allows you to do a reconceptualization that unites things that can't otherwise be united. Okay, so one of the issues might be, well, what is an abstraction composed of? And I would say, well, it depends on the domain in which the abstraction is being implemented. So an abstraction about the world is slightly different than an abstraction about you. I think what they have in common is that when you make abstract representations of the world, you're making abstract representations of the world as a place to act. And that's a critically important thing to understand because we're scientific in our explicit cognitive presuppositions. We think that world models are models of the world as a place of things. So we're kind of taking a page from St. Augustine in some sense. The world is made out of objectively existing, independent, material entities, and when you develop understanding about the world, what you're doing is producing a map of those entities. And the thing is, that's true in a narrow sense, in that that is what you're doing when you're doing science, but science itself is nested inside a narrative structure, as we talked about before. So then the question is, what's the nature of the more comprehensive narrative structure? And I don't think that you can understand, you cannot understand profound narratives unless you understand this underlying set of assumptions. You're not naturally predisposed to view the world in objective terms. Now, we talked about that from a Darwinian and Newtonian point of view last time. So when I told you what I thought about that, but here's the idea, you know. So let's say, we'll talk about the domain of morality, and the reason that I put this under the domain of morality is because it has to do with how you do act and how you should act. So that's a moral domain. And then I would say, most of the time when we're communicating information that we find relevant to one another, what we're communicating is moral information. And the moral information is how to perceive and act in the world such that things work. Now, obviously you can have a debate about what those things are, but that's still what we're trying to do. And you can debate about what work means and so on and so forth. And we're doing that all the time because it's complex. So if I say, well, you're a good person, then we could unpack that. I could say, okay, well, what are the snakes inside being a good person? And we could say, well, that's it's actually, good person is a representation of a complex hierarchy. And so I've outlined some of the hierarchy here. If you're a good person, one element of being a good person, although maybe not a necessary element, but one element, is that you're a good parent. And then a sub-element of that is that you can take care of your family. And a sub-element of that might be that you can play with the baby, or that you can cook a meal. Now, you don't have to hit a home run on every single one of the constituent sub-elements of the entire category in order to qualify as a good person, but you can see that there's a shared structure, you know, that people recognize that's characteristic of a good person, that's actually composed of action patterns and perceptions. Has nothing to do in some sense with the objective world. It's a completely different way of looking at it. So if you're going to play with the baby, well, then you think, well, what do you have to do to play with the baby? And so you might make a goofy face at the baby, because babies respond to that sort of thing, sometimes by crying, but often by smiling. You can tickle their feet, you can kind of poke them, you can play with their arms, you know, you can rock them back and forth, and you watch the baby, so you find out if it's having fun too. And now, the thing that's interesting about actually playing with the baby is that the phenomena that you're manifesting is no longer abstract and conceptual. It's embodied. Play decomposes into movement, patterns of movement. It's like a dance. In fact, if you take a mother and she's getting along with her baby and you videotape them interacting, what you see is that the mothers who get along with their baby are doing a dance with them, and the baby is harmonized with the mother. So there's this sort of melodic and fluid dance, whereas the baby that's not getting along with its mother, it's more like having a conversation with someone who disagrees with absolutely everything that you say in random ways. No, so you start off an invitation to the conversation and they nail you with a non sequitur, so that's a non-starter, and then you try it again and they nail you with something else that seems completely irrelevant, and so it's jerky and discontinuous, and you see that with people interacting with children all the time. I think that's part of the reason why people use dance as a mating strategy. It's like, you know, is this person capable of mutual harmonious imitation? Now, it's not a perfect test, but it's not too bad. It's got some utility in it. So the abstract narrative representation, you're a good person, that is not an objective category. The abstract representation, you're a good person, decomposes at the highest level of resolution into a sequence of actions. And Piaget, for example, would say that, well, you learn those basic actions as you're putting your nervous system together from birth until now. So you're building yourself up at the bottom, because so when you dance, you know, there's certain movements you have to make, and those are movements that you could make in other circumstances that would also be useful. And so for Piaget, you build yourself from the bottom of this hierarchy towards the top. Okay, so then, you know, one of the things that you might note is that as you go up the chain of abstraction, arguments about what those categories contain become more and more likely. You know, and so you might say, for example, to your mate that being able to prepare a decent meal is such an important sub-element of being a good person that if you fail to do it or can't, that actually means you're a bad person. And you can see right away why that would provoke all sorts of arguments. And so part of the reason that I'm bringing this up is because we're engaged in a constant process of mutual exploration to determine how these hierarchies are properly arranged and what are necessary subcategories of them and how those subcategories should be hierarchically instantiated with regards to one another. And we have to have some agreement about that or we actually can't communicate. So like if my stance is you burn the vegetables, you're a bad person, and your stance is I burn the vegetables and who the hell cares about that, then the fact that our hierarchies of values are structured completely differently means we're going to have a very difficult time communicating, and there's going to be a lot of conflict about how that conceptual structure should be reorganized. And that's actually what you're doing when you're arguing with someone about something important. It's like you're trying to say, okay, we need to get our hierarchies, our narrative hierarchies synced so that what you want and what I want can happen at the same time, and so that we understand each other. And we can partly do that by talking. We can also do it by suppressing the other person, which we tend to do an awful lot, or suppressing ourselves in favor of the other person, and so forth and so on. But the thing is, there's that those places of non-agreement are like, they're like tunnels into the complex underlying reality that we have to deal with, and places where the nature of that, the nature of the complexity of dealing with that become apparent. And part of what happens as a consequence of that is people just don't have those discussions. They don't know how to do it. They can't decompose the situation. You know, and I can give you an example of that which you're going to face. Let's say you're in a family. You're married to someone, or whatever the equivalent happens to be. You both have a career. Whose career is more important? You think, well, it doesn't matter. It's like, it matters, because there will be times when you have to make a choice between the two career paths. It's like, okay, well, how do you do that? And the answer to that is, you don't know, and neither does anyone else, and worse, there are no rules for having the discussion. You have to come up with all the rules and everything about the discussion, because you can't even tell when you're being reasonable. You know, because you might say, well, the person who makes the most money, their career is the most important. It's like, are you going to accept that? Do you think that's valid? And if you don't, okay, fine. What are you going to use as an alternative criteria? It's very, very difficult. It's very, very difficult. You know, and most of the way we solve this as collectives is we have standard hierarchies of narratives that we just all adopt. That's our identity with our history. That's a role. If you adopt your role and I adopt mine, and my hierarchy is structured to take your role into account, and the reverse is also true, we don't have to have a conflict. Now, you might have a conflict as an individual with your role. That's a whole different story. But if you pop out of your role and I pop out of mine, we're in no man's land. And in no man's land, three things happen: tyranny, slavery, or negotiation. And most people can't negotiate. And the reason for that is it's too damn complicated. What time is it?